In 1944, the United States Coast Guard released 29 reindeer onto a treeless island in the middle of the Bering Sea. There were no predators, no fences, no competition, just an endless carpet of lichen stretching across the tundra. Within 2 decades, those 29 animals became 6,000, and then, almost overnight, they were nearly all dead. St. Matthew Island is one of the clearest, most disturbing examples of what happens when humans drop a species into a system it was never meant to be part of and walk away. So where exactly is this place? St. Matthew sits roughly 330 kilometers west of the Alaskan mainland, deep in the central Bering Sea. It's far from everything. The nearest permanently inhabited land is Nunivak Island, which itself is not exactly a bustling population center. St. Matthew stretches about 57 kilometers long and maybe 6 kilometers at its widest point, with 2 smaller companion islands, Hall Island to the northwest and tiny Pinnacle Island just beyond that. Together they form a small archipelago that most maps barely bother to label. The terrain is almost entirely tundra, low grasses, mosses, lichens, wildflowers in summer, and virtually nothing taller than your knee. There are no trees, not one. The island sits below the tree line and exposed to the full force of Bering Sea weather, which is not gentle. Winters bring ferocious winds, thick fog blankets the coastline for much of the summer, and the surrounding sea ice makes approach by boat unreliable at best. This is not a place that invites human presence. It tolerates brief visits and not much more. The island's geography is volcanic in origin, though it hasn't erupted in a very long time. Steep cliffs drop into the sea along much of the coastline, and rocky headlands jut out at odd angles. Inland, the landscape rolls gently, and if you happen to visit during the brief Arctic summer, you might actually find it beautiful in a stark, windswept way. But beauty and hospitality are different things. St. Matthew has almost no natural harbor, no sheltered bay worth the name, and the surrounding waters are some of the most unpredictable in the North Pacific. All of which raises an obvious question. Why would anyone bother with this island at all? The answer, for most of its recorded history, is that they mostly didn't. Russian explorers were the first Europeans to document St. Matthew, likely sometime in the 1760s, during the wave of Russian maritime expeditions pushing east through the Aleutians and into the Bering Sea. The island got its name from the Russian Orthodox tradition of naming newly discovered lands after the saint whose feast day fell nearest to the date of discovery. Beyond that initial charting, the Russians didn't do much with it. There was no fresh water worth relying on, no timber, no obvious reason to establish a settlement. Fur traders likely knew of it, but with far richer hunting grounds available on the Pribilof Islands and along the Aleutian chain, St. Matthew just wasn't worth the detour. After the United States purchased Alaska from Russia in 1867, American surveyors and naturalists started working their way through the territory's outer islands. One of the more notable early visits came from Henry Wood Elliott, a naturalist and artist who traveled extensively through the Bering Sea region in the 1870s. Elliott visited St. Matthew and documented the island's wildlife, including its enormous seabird colonies and its population of Arctic foxes. He noted the island's thick lichen cover, a detail that would become far more significant than anyone could have guessed at the time. Elliott also observed the island's unique vole population, a small rodent found nowhere else on Earth. That species, now called the St. Matthew Island vole, still lives there today. It's one of the few mammals that can actually call this island home without human help. For decades after Elliott's visit, St. Matthew returned to obscurity. Almost no one went there. Almost no one thought about it. The island sat empty of humans, populated by foxes, voles, seabirds, and that thick, undisturbed lichen crust that had been building up across the tundra for centuries, possibly thousands of years. That lichen is important, remember it, because it becomes the central character in this story later on. Now here's where the timeline lurches forward to the 1940s, and where the real story begins. During World War II, the United States military spread across the Aleutian Islands and the broader Bering Sea region in response to the Japanese occupation of Attu and Kiska. Suddenly, these forgotten specks of rock in the middle of nowhere became strategically relevant. The military needed navigation stations, weather outposts, and radio installations scattered across the region, and St. Matthew got its turn. In 1944, the Coast Guard established a Loran navigation station on the island. A small crew of men, roughly 19 personnel, was stationed there to operate the equipment. Now, put yourself in their position for a second. You're a Coast Guard serviceman posted to a treeless, fog-bound island in the middle of the Bering Sea. The nearest town might as well be on the moon. Supply ships come when weather allows, which isn't always when you need them. The military, to its credit, recognized that these men might need an emergency food source if supply lines were disrupted. The war in the Pacific was grinding forward. Japanese forces had already touched Alaskan soil, and no one could guarantee that a ship full of canned beef would show up on schedule. So, someone made a decision. 29 reindeer were loaded onto a ship and brought to St. Matthew Island. The logic was straightforward. Reindeer can survive in Arctic conditions. The island had abundant vegetation. If the men ever found themselves cut off from supplies, they could slaughter a reindeer and eat. It was a practical wartime contingency measure, nothing more. The reindeer were released onto the island and the men went about their work operating the Loran station. The war continued, and for a little while, the reindeer and the servicemen coexisted on that wind-battered rock without much incident. But here's the thing about wartime installations in remote places. Once the war ended, the military's interest evaporated almost instantly. The Loran station on St. Matthew was decommissioned. The men left. The equipment was either removed or abandoned. And the 29 reindeer? Nobody came back for them. They weren't part of the decommission plan. They were just animals on an island. Not anyone's problem anymore. That was it. The humans left and the reindeer stayed. This is the point in the story where you need to understand something about reindeer ecology to appreciate what happened next. Reindeer are herbivores, and in Arctic and subarctic environments, their primary food source during winter is lichen. Specifically, they rely heavily on species like Cladonia and Cetraria, the spongy, pale-colored ground cover that carpets tundra landscapes. Lichen is remarkable stuff. It grows incredibly slowly, sometimes just a few millimeters per year, but it can blanket vast areas over centuries if left undisturbed. It's nutritious enough to sustain large herds through harsh winters when other vegetation is buried under snow. St. Matthew Island had an extraordinary lichen cover. Centuries of growth, totally ungrazed by any large herbivore, had created a deep, lush carpet across much of the island's interior. For the 29 reindeer released there in 1944, it must have seemed like paradise. No wolves, no bears, no lynx, no competition from other grazers, just endless food in every direction. And so the reindeer did what any population does when resources are abundant and threats are absent. They reproduced. This is where a wildlife biologist named David Klein enters the story, and his work on St. Matthew Island would eventually become one of the most cited case studies in population ecology. Klein was a researcher with the University of Alaska, and he first visited St. Matthew in 1957, 13 years after the reindeer had been introduced. What he found was already remarkable. The original 29 animals had grown to an estimated 1,350. That's a huge increase, but the island was large enough and the lichen cover still rich enough that the herd appeared to be thriving. The reindeer Klein observed in 57 were healthy, well-fed, in good physical condition. He documented his findings, and there was no particular cause for alarm. Klein came back in 1963, 6 years later. This time, the numbers stopped him cold. The herd had exploded to approximately 6,000 animals. 6,000! From 29 in less than 2 decades with no predation and no management. The reindeer were everywhere. Klein later described them as being in excellent condition, fat, with thick coats, showing no obvious signs of nutritional stress. The island was still feeding them, but Klein, being a trained ecologist, could see what was coming. He noticed that the lichen cover was significantly reduced compared to his 57 visit. The reindeer were eating it faster than it could grow back, much faster. He understood that this trajectory was unsustainable, but the scale of what would actually happen next exceeded even his concerns. I want to pause on that number for a moment. 6,000 reindeer on a single island, derived from 29 animals in 19 years, with no human intervention whatsoever. No feeding program, no veterinary care, no culling, just exponential growth in a system with no breaks. If you've ever studied population dynamics, you know where this goes. But knowing the theory and seeing the reality are very different things. Klein returned to St. Matthew Island in 1966, 3 years after his last visit, and what he found was a landscape out of a nightmare. The herd was gone. Not reduced, gone. Where 6,000 reindeer had been grazing 3 years earlier, Klein found 42. 42 living animals. 41 of them were females. There was a single male, and every one of them looked terrible. Emaciated, stunted, visibly unhealthy. Scattered across the island were skeletons. Hundreds and hundreds of reindeer skeletons, bleaching on the tundra, half buried in moss and mud. The bones were everywhere. Klein described the scene in his published research, and even his measured, scientific language couldn't fully mask how shocking it was. So, what happened? The answer is both simple and devastating. The reindeer ate themselves out of existence. By 1963, the herd of 6,000 had consumed the island's lichen cover far beyond its capacity to regenerate. That thick carpet of centuries-old growth was stripped down to almost nothing. And then winter came. Not an unusual winter, not some freak event, just a normal Bering Sea winter, the kind the island gets every single year. Heavy snow, bitter cold, fierce winds. But this time, the food that had sustained the herd through previous winters simply wasn't there anymore. The die-off was catastrophic. Thousands of reindeer starved to death in a matter of months during the winter of 1963 to 64. The animals that survived were the ones that somehow found enough residual vegetation to hang on. The strongest females mostly, plus that one lone male. But even these survivors were in desperate shape. They hadn't escaped the crash so much as they barely outlived it. And those 42 survivors? They didn't rebuild the herd. They couldn't. The island was too degraded. The lichen that had taken centuries to accumulate was gone, and lichen doesn't grow back on a human timescale. We're talking decades, possibly centuries, before St. Matthew's ground cover could return to anything close to what it had been before 1944. The remaining reindeer dwindled over the following years. By the early 1980s, the last reindeer on St. Matthew Island were dead. Every single one. The population went from 29 to 6,000 to 0 in roughly 4 decades. That fact still kind of stuns me every time I read it. 0. David Klein published his findings, and the St. Matthew Island reindeer became an instant classic in ecological literature. The case study appears in biology textbooks worldwide. It's used to teach students about carrying capacity, the maximum number of individuals an environment can sustain indefinitely, and about what happens when a population overshoots it. The reindeer of St. Matthew are the textbook example, almost literally, of boom and bust population dynamics in a closed system. But I think there's something about this story that the textbook version doesn't quite capture, and it's this. None of it was the reindeer's fault. They did exactly what reindeer do. They ate available food, and they reproduced. They didn't make a choice to overgraze the island. They responded to conditions. Abundant food, no predators, the way evolution had programmed them to respond. The problem wasn't the reindeer. The problem was the decision to put them there in the first place. 29 animals, released onto an island ecosystem that had no evolutionary experience with large herbivores, by humans who gave it roughly 30 seconds of thought as a wartime food contingency and then forgot about it. That's the whole story. A casual human decision made for practical short-term reasons with zero consideration of long-term ecological consequences produced a catastrophe that wiped out the reindeer and fundamentally altered the island's ecosystem. And then the humans left, and the island was left to deal with the aftermath alone. Here's where I want to zoom out for a moment, because the St. Matthew reindeer story doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's part of a much broader pattern of humans introducing species to islands and watching things go sideways. Islands are especially vulnerable to this kind of disruption because their ecosystems evolved in isolation. Species on islands didn't develop alongside the competitors, predators, or grazers that exist on continents. When you drop a new species into that system, whether it's reindeer on St. Matthew, rabbits on the Quarry Island, goats on the Galapagos, or rats on basically any Pacific island, the result is almost always ecological damage, sometimes irreversible. The St. Matthew case is unusual mainly in how clean and well documented it is. Most island ecological disasters are messy, multiple introduced species, ongoing human habitation, complicating factors that make it hard to isolate cause and effect. But St. Matthew was almost like a controlled experiment. One species introduced, no human interference afterward, no predators, no competing grazers, just reindeer and lichen on an island, and the outcome was total collapse. It's the purity of the case that makes it so frequently cited and so unsettling. But the reindeer weren't the only thing affected, and this part of the story gets less attention than it should. When those 6,000 reindeer stripped the lichen cover from St. Matthew Island, they didn't just destroy their own food source, they altered the entire ground-level ecosystem. Lichen isn't just a food, it's a habitat. It holds moisture, it provides cover for invertebrates and small mammals, it stabilizes soil against wind erosion. When you remove it, the cascade effects ripple outward in ways that are hard to fully predict. Remember the St. Matthew Island vole I mentioned earlier? That unique little rodent found nowhere else on the planet? The vole population was directly affected by the habitat changes the reindeer caused. With the lichen and ground cover stripped away, the voles lost shelter and food resources. Their population dynamics shifted. The island's Arctic fox population, which depended partly on voles as prey, was also affected. The entire food web on St. Matthew was disrupted by the introduction and subsequent crash of a single species that didn't belong there. Now I want to come back to the physical island itself, because even if you'll probably never visit St. Matthew, almost no one does, it helps to understand what you'd actually see if you went there today. St. Matthew Island is currently part of the Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge, one of the most remote units in the entire National Wildlife Refuge system. There is no permanent human presence on the island, no buildings in use, no airstrip, no dock, no scheduled transportation of any kind. Getting there requires chartering a vessel or aircraft, and even then, weather conditions in the Bering Sea make any visit a gamble. Researchers who study the island typically arrange trips months in advance, and sometimes wait days for a weather window that allows safe landing. If you could walk across St. Matthew today, you'd find a landscape that's slowly healing but still bears the scars of what happened. The lichen is growing back, but it's been over 60 years since the reindeer crash, and the recovery is far from complete. In some areas, the ground cover has returned to something approaching its pre-reindeer state. In others, the soil is still thin and exposed, with mosses and grasses filling in where lichen once dominated. The full restoration of the island's lichen carpet, if it ever fully recovers, could take centuries more. What you would see is birds, enormous numbers of birds. St. Matthew and Hall Islands host some of the largest seabird colonies in the Bering Sea. Millions of seabirds nest on the cliffs and coastal areas during breeding season. Auklets, murres, puffins, kittiwakes, fulmars. The cliffs come alive with sound and motion in summer, a wall of birds stacked in every available crevice. And among those seabirds is one species that makes St. Matthew genuinely special to ornithologists worldwide: Mackay's bunting. This small, pale songbird is one of the rarest breeding birds in North America, and St. Matthew and Hall Islands are essentially the only places on Earth where it nests. The entire global breeding population of Mackay's bunting is concentrated on these two islands. During winter, some individuals migrate to the western Alaska coast, but for nesting, this is it. A single, remote, wind-hammered archipelago in the middle of the Bering Sea is the only nursery this species has. If something catastrophic happened to St. Matthew and Hall Islands, a major oil spill, a new invasive species, a disease, Mackay's bunting could be pushed toward extinction. That's how narrow the margin is. I find that both amazing and a little terrifying, honestly. An entire species hanging on in one of the most inhospitable places in the Northern Hemisphere with basically no backup plan. The Arctic foxes are still there too. St. Matthew's fox population has persisted despite the upheaval caused by the reindeer boom and crash. They survive on a diet of seabirds, bird eggs, voles, and whatever marine resources wash up on the beaches. In lean times, they scavenge aggressively along the shoreline. They're tough animals, well adapted to the island's brutal conditions, but their population fluctuates with the availability of prey, particularly the voles, which go through their own population cycles. As for the remains of human presence on St. Matthew, there's not much left. The old Coast Guard Loran station from the 1940s has largely deteriorated. Some debris remains, rusted metal, fragments of structures, but the island's weather is relentless, and anything not built to withstand it gets broken down pretty quickly. There have been occasional cleanup efforts over the years to remove military debris from the island, since the refuge status requires minimizing human impact on the ecosystem. But visiting researchers still occasionally stumble across remnants from the wartime era, half buried in tundra or scattered along the coast. The island has attracted very few visitors over the decades, and that's unlikely to change. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service manages access carefully, and there's no infrastructure to support tourism even if someone wanted to go. Occasionally, wildlife photographers or film crews make the expedition to document the seabird colonies or photograph Mackay's bunting in its breeding habitat. Scientists studying Arctic and subarctic ecology have conducted periodic surveys, but these visits are rare, brief, and logistically difficult. St. Matthew remains, for all practical purposes, a place humans left behind. And that brings me to something I've been thinking about while researching this. There's a certain irony in the fact that the best thing humans ever did for St. Matthew Island was leave. The worst damage was caused not by occupation, but by a single, thoughtless introduction. 29 animals, no follow-up plan, and the healing began only after people stopped interfering. The island doesn't need us. It never did. It was doing fine for thousands of years before anyone showed up, and it's doing better now that we're gone, even with the ecological wounds we left behind. But the story of St. Matthew isn't just an environmental parable. I mean, it works as one, and it's used as one all the time. But I think that framing can actually flatten the story into something too neat. Real ecosystems don't exist to teach us lessons. St. Matthew Island is a place, a real, physical, complicated place, with its own weather and its own wildlife and its own rhythms, that have nothing to do with what humans want to learn from it. The reindeer crash happened there because of specific decisions made by specific people at a specific time, and the consequences played out according to biology and weather and chance. It's a story, not a fable, and it's a reminder, whether we want it to be or not, that the things we do to places can outlast us by generations. Those 29 reindeer were somebody's afternoon decision in 1944. The island is still recovering 80 years later. Before I wrap up, a few more things I came across while looking into this that I thought were worth mentioning. St. Matthew Island is actually one of the most isolated landmasses in the Bering Sea. It sits on the continental shelf, which means the waters around it are relatively shallow compared to the open ocean, but that doesn't make them any calmer. The Bering Sea is notorious among mariners for its unpredictable storms, and the waters around St. Matthew are no exception. Even modern vessels approach with caution. The island also has a somewhat unusual geological feature, a series of volcanic remnant formations along its coast that have been sculpted by wind and waves into striking natural arches and sea stacks. Pinnacle Island, the smallest of the 3 islands in the group, is essentially one dramatic rock spire jutting out of the ocean. It's apparently quite something to see from a boat, though finding reliable photos is harder than you'd think for a place this remote. And one more thing. The St. Matthew Island vole, that unique little rodent I mentioned, is the only native land mammal on the island. No other terrestrial mammal evolved there or colonized it naturally. The foxes likely arrived via sea ice at some point in the distant past, but the vole is the true endemic. It exists on St. Matthew and nowhere else. Its continued survival on the island, despite everything that happened with the reindeer and the resulting habitat disruption, is actually a quiet little success story in itself. The vole adapted. The vole endured. Honestly, kind of rooting for the vole at this point. St. Matthew Island sits out there in the Bering Sea today, empty of people, slowly regrowing what was taken from it. Home to millions of seabirds and one very rare bunting, and a population of stubborn little voles. It doesn't know it's famous in ecology textbooks. It doesn't know it's a cautionary tale. It's just an island, doing what islands do when you leave them alone. If you've ever heard anything about St. Matthew, or if you know something I missed, drop it in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.